The morning of June 19, 1944, broke over the Philippine Sea with deceptive tranquility. The water stretched endlessly in every direction, a dark blue mirror reflecting scattered clouds that drifted lazily across the tropical sky. Aboard the USS Lexington, the air smelled of salt, aviation fuel, and hot metal, a combination that had become as familiar as breathing to the men of Air Group 16. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Caldwell stood on the flight deck, squinting against the rising sun as he watched the deck crews prepare his F-6F-3 Hellcat for what would be his third combat mission of the war. At 23 years old, Jimmy was young even by naval aviation standards, but his hands were steady and his eyes held the kind of focus that came from knowing exactly what was at stake. The scuttlebutt had been circulating since dawn. Japanese carrier planes were inbound. A lot of them. The intelligence reports had been fragmented, urgent, almost panicked. Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet had detected a massive enemy strike force launching from Japanese carriers somewhere to the west. The numbers were staggering. Possibly 300 aircraft or more, an aerial armada meant to destroy the American fleet in one decisive blow. This wasn't going to be a patrol or a routine escort mission. This was going to be a knife fight at 20,000 feet, and everyone knew it. Jimmy ran his hand along the Hellcat's fuselage, feeling the rivets and the sun-warmed aluminum beneath his palm. The aircraft was a beast. 18 cylinders of Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, 6.50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, and armor plating behind the pilot's seat that might stop a 7.7 mm round if you were lucky. It was heavier than the Japanese Zero, slower in a turn, but it could take punishment and keep flying. That's what the instructors had hammered into them at Pensacola. The Zero can dance, but the Hellcat can brawl. Lieutenant Caldwell. The voice cut through the ambient noise of the flight deck. Jimmy turned to see his wingman, Ensign Bobby Hernandez, jogging toward him with his flight gear already strapped on. Bobby was shorter, darker, with a perpetual grin that never quite reached his eyes anymore. Not since they'd lost 3 pilots from their squadron over truck 2 months ago. "They're calling it the Marianas Turkey Shoot already," Bobby said, trying to force some levity into his voice. "Like we're going duck hunting or something." Jimmy didn't smile. "Ducks don't shoot back with 20mm cannons, Bobby." The loudspeaker crackled to life across the deck. "All pilots, man your aircraft. Launch operations commencing in 15 minutes. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The deck erupted into controlled chaos. Plane captains scrambled beneath wings, pulling chocks and disconnecting ground power cables. Ordnance crews made final checks on ammunition belts, ensuring every 6th round was a tracer so pilots could see where their fire was going. The air boss stood in his tower, coordinating the ballet of 36 fighters preparing to launch into a battle that would determine control of the Pacific. Jimmy climbed into his cockpit, the familiar routine calming his nerves despite the gravity of the situation. Parachute harness. Check. Shoulder straps. Secure. Stick and rudder. Free movement. Gun sight. Powered on, reticle glowing orange in the morning light. He pressed the starter button and the big radial engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a burst of blue-gray smoke from the exhaust stacks. The whole aircraft vibrated with barely contained power. The ship turned into the wind, and one by one, the Hellcats began rolling down the deck. Jimmy watched as the fighter ahead of him accelerated, lifted off the bow, and climbed away, its propeller cutting circles in the humid air. Then it was his turn. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engine's full fury pressing him back into his seat. The deck streaked past, faster and faster, until suddenly there was nothing beneath his wheels but 200 feet of empty air down to the ocean. He retracted his landing gear and began his climb, forming up with Bobby and 4 other pilots in a loose combat spread. Their orders were simple: intercept and destroy the incoming Japanese strike before they could reach the fleet. No matter what. As they clawed for altitude, passing through 10,000 feet, Jimmy could see the task force spread out below. Dozens of carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers arranged in protective circles, their wakes drawing white lines across the dark water. It looked invincible from up here. But he knew better. One bomb in the right place could send any of those ships to the bottom. At 18,000 feet, the radio crackled, all Hellcat flights, this is Lexington CIC. Bogies bearing 270, range 40 miles, altitude Angels 15. Vector 270 and engage. Repeat, you are cleared hot. Jimmy's heart rate kicked up another notch. 40 miles. About 8 minutes of flying time. He scanned the sky ahead, seeing nothing but blue emptiness and scattered cumulus clouds. The enemy was out there, though. Hundreds of them. Zeros, Vals, Kates, the entire Japanese carrier air arm committed to one desperate throw of the dice. Stay tight, Jimmy transmitted to his flight. Check your 6 every 5 seconds. Don't fixate on one target. And for God's sake, don't chase them down to the deck. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 30 miles. 25. Then, at 20 miles, Jimmy saw them, tiny dark specks against the distant clouds, like a swarm of insects. But as they closed, the specks resolved into distinct aircraft, the distinctive silhouettes of Mitsubishi A6M0s with their long, slender wings and the fat, vulnerable shapes of Aichi D-3A dive bombers beneath them. Tally-ho! Someone shouted over the radio. 2 o'clock low, multiple bandits. And then the sky exploded into violence. Jimmy pushed the stick forward, diving toward the enemy formation with his flight following in trail. The airspeed indicator wound up rapidly. 200 knots, 250, 300. The Hellcat's big engine howled, and the wind screamed past the canopy as they plummeted from altitude like hawks stooping on prey. The Japanese formation was massive, stretching across miles of sky. At least 50 dive bombers in the center, surrounded by 30 or more Zeros flying escort. The Zeros had spotted the incoming Americans and were already turning to engage, their light frames allowing them to snap into tight turns that would have torn the wings off a heavier fighter. "Brake right! Brake right!" Bobby's voice was sharp with adrenaline. Jimmy hauled on the stick, pulling 4, then 5 GS as he reversed direction. A Zero flashed past where he'd been seconds before, its guns winking orange fire. Tracer rounds drew lazy-looking lines through the air, but Jimmy knew they were traveling at over 2,000 feet per second. If you could see them, they'd already missed. He rolled inverted and pulled, coming down behind a Zero that was pursuing one of his squadron mates. The enemy pilot was good, staying with the fleeing Hellcat through a series of barrel rolls and reversals. Jimmy lined up the shot, leading the target by 3 aircraft lengths, and squeezed the trigger. The 6.50 caliber guns thundered, and the Hellcat shuddered with recoil. Bright tracers arced out toward the Zero, walking up its fuselage from tail to cockpit. Pieces flew off the enemy fighter, part of the elevator, a section of the canopy, something that might have been the pilot's headrest. The Zero snap-rolled left and went into a vertical dive, trailing smoke. "Scratch 1." Jimmy called, already scanning for the next threat. "You never watched your kill go down. That's how you died." The furball had spread across several cubic miles of sky now, with individual dogfights spiraling down from 20,000 feet toward the ocean below. Everywhere Jimmy looked, aircraft were burning, falling, or locked in desperate maneuvering combat. A Hellcat streaked past, chased by 2 Zeros. Another Zero exploded in mid-air, victim of someone's deflection shot. A dive bomber, trying to escape, had its tail shot off and tumbled toward the sea like a falling leaf. Jimmy's flight had been broken up in the initial merge, and now he was essentially alone, surrounded by hostiles. He climbed back toward the bombers, knowing that was the real target. The Zeros were dangerous, but the dive bombers were the ones that could sink ships and kill thousands of sailors. He rolled in behind a Vi dive bomber that was trying to dive away to safety. The Japanese aircraft was slower, less maneuverable, and completely exposed. Jimmy closed to 300 yards and fired a short burst. The .50 caliber rounds punched through the bomber's thin aluminum skin like it was paper, and suddenly the entire aircraft blossomed into an orange fireball. Jimmy flew through the debris field, hearing small pieces of wreckage ping off his wings and fuselage. "Two down," he muttered to himself, pulling up and looking for another target. That's when he felt the impacts. A burst of 20mm cannon fire from a Zero he hadn't seen, probably diving from the sun, stitched across his right wing root and cowling. The explosions were like hammers hitting the aircraft, and immediately warning lights lit up across his instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping. Engine temperature rising. A thin stream of gray smoke began trailing from beneath the cowling, growing thicker with each passing second. "Shit!" Jimmy keyed his radio. "This is Caldwell. I'm hit. Engines burning." The Zero came around for another pass, clearly intending to finish him off. Jimmy pushed the damaged Hellcat into a hard diving turn, the controls growing mushy as hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines. The Zero followed, its pilot probably smelling an easy victory. But Jimmy had been flying this aircraft for 8 months. He knew every quirk, every tendency, every ounce of performance it could give. He let the Zero close, watching it in his rear-view mirror, waiting for exactly the right moment. The enemy pilot opened fire, and tracers began walking toward Jimmy's tail. Then Jimmy hauled back on the stick with both hands, pulling the damaged Hellcat into a brutal 7G turn that grayed out his vision and made his G-suit inflate painfully around his legs and abdomen. The Zero, lighter and more maneuverable in normal circumstances, couldn't handle the unexpected reversal at high speed. It skidded wide, overshooting. Now Jimmy was on his tail. He had maybe 30 seconds before his engine seized or caught fire completely. The smoke was thick now, pouring back over the canopy and making it hard to see. The oil temperature gauge was pegged in the red. The engine was making horrible grinding noises, metal eating metal as bearings failed and pistons scored cylinder walls. But 30 seconds was enough. Jimmy lined up the shot as the Zero tried desperately to evade, pulling hard left, then right, then into a climbing chandelle. It didn't matter. Jimmy led the target perfectly and fired, holding the trigger down for a full 3-second burst that drained half his remaining ammunition. The .50 caliber rounds tore into the Zero's fuel tanks, located directly in front of the cockpit, and the aircraft exploded with such force that Jimmy felt the shock wave through his own aircraft. "3," he said through gritted teeth. The engine was definitely on fire now. He could see flames licking back from the cowling, small at first but growing larger. The heat was beginning to penetrate the firewall, and he could smell burning oil and electrical insulation. In a few more seconds, the fire would reach the main fuel tanks in the wings, and then another Zero appeared in his peripheral vision, diving in from 4 o'clock high. Every instinct screamed at Jimmy to bail out. The aircraft was dying beneath him. The fire was spreading. The smart move, the sane move, was to pop the canopy, roll inverted, and drop into the silk. He'd be in the water in a few minutes, and the rescue submarines were good about picking up downed pilots in this area. But there was something else, something deeper than rational thought. That fourth Zero wasn't just another target. It was another enemy fighter that might get through to the fleet, might put a bomb or torpedo into one of the carriers, might kill 100 or 1,000 American sailors who were depending on pilots like Jimmy to stop them. The fire was spreading along his right wing now, bright orange flames trailing back in his slipstream. His goggles were fogging from the heat. The controls were barely responding. Jimmy pulled the Hellcat around one more time, the aircraft shuddering and protesting, pieces of burning fabric and metal beginning to tear away from the wing. The Zero pilot, confident he was facing a crippled opponent, came in for the kill without any fancy maneuvering, just a straight, simple gun run. It was his last mistake. Time seemed to slow down to individual heartbeats. Jimmy could see every detail with crystal clarity. The red circle on the Zero's wings, the black exhaust stain along the cowling, even what might have been the enemy pilot's face behind the windscreen. The range closed, 500 yards, 400, 300. The Zero's guns started firing, and Jimmy watched the muzzle flashes like distant stars winking on and off. Tracers began reaching toward him, some passing over his canopy, others walking up from below. One round punched through his windscreen with a sharp crack, spiderwebbing the plexiglass and sending fragments of shattered material flying around the cockpit. Another hit his left wing root, and he heard the metal scream. But Jimmy's hands were steady on the stick and throttle, the gun sight's orange reticle centered perfectly on the approaching Zero's engine cowling. The fire spreading across his own aircraft had reached the cockpit now. He could see flames licking at the edges of his peripheral vision, could feel the terrible heat even through his flight suit and gloves. Smoke was filling the cockpit, making him cough and his eyes water. 200 yards. The Zero grew larger in his gun sight, filling his entire field of view. This had to be the shot. There wouldn't be time for another. His ammunition counter showed only about 50 rounds per gun remaining. Barely 3 seconds of fire. The engine was making a horrible rattling sound now, like a bucket of bolts being shaken, and the propeller was beginning to windmill irregularly as cylinders failed one by one. 100 yards. Jimmy squeezed the trigger. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns roared one final time, the recoil rocking the already unstable aircraft. The convergence point for his guns was set at 300 yards, which meant that at this close range, all 6 streams of fire were concentrating on a spot only a few feet wide, right on the Zero's spinner and engine. The effect was catastrophic. The Zero's propeller simply disintegrated, fragments of aluminum spinning away in all directions. The engine cowling peeled back like the petals of a steel flower. The entire nose section of the aircraft seemed to crumple and collapse inward. For a fraction of a second, Jimmy saw the enemy pilot's face clearly, eyes wide with shock and terror behind his goggles. Then the Zero exploded. The blast was so close that it hit Jimmy's Hellcat like a physical blow, flipping the damaged fighter nearly inverted. Debris hammered against the wings and fuselage. Pieces of aluminum, chunks of engine, probably parts of the pilot too, though Jimmy tried not to think about that. His canopy cracked further. Something large, maybe the Zero's wheel, smashed into his tail and he felt the aircraft lurch sickeningly. 4, Jimmy gasped, fighting to right the Hellcat as it tumbled through the sky. But the aircraft was finished now, and deep down he knew it. The fire had spread across the entire right wing and was working its way inboard toward the main fuel tank. The engine had seized completely, the propeller frozen in place, and without thrust, the heavy fighter was dropping out of the sky like a stone. Altitude was bleeding away rapidly, 12,000 feet, 11, 10. The hydraulic system had failed entirely, meaning he couldn't operate the landing gear, flaps, or dive brakes even if there had been a carrier deck to land on, which there wasn't. The electrical system was shorting out in showers of sparks behind the instrument panel. His radio was dead, filled with static and then nothing. 9,000 feet. Jimmy reached up with his left hand, his right hand still locked on the stick in a death grip, and pulled the canopy jettison handle. The canopy was supposed to blow clear with explosive bolts, but the system had been damaged. The canopy cracked open a few inches, then jammed. The sudden influx of wind made the fire flare up even more intensely, and now he was definitely running out of time. He could feel the heat on his face and hands, could smell his own hair singeing. 8,000 feet. With strength born of pure desperation, Jimmy planted both feet against the instrument panel and pushed backward while simultaneously pulling up on the canopy jettison handle. Something gave way with a metallic snap, and suddenly the canopy ripped free, tumbling away into the slipstream. The wind hit him like a freight train, tearing at his flight suit and helmet, threatening to rip him out of the seat prematurely. 7,000 feet. He reached down between his legs and pulled the seat harness release. The straps fell away from his shoulders and chest. Now the only thing keeping him in the aircraft was his own grip on the cockpit edge and his feet braced against the rudder pedals. The Hellcat was in a spiral now, corkscrewing downward. The entire right wing fully engulfed in flames that stretched 20 feet behind the aircraft. 6,000 feet. "Come on, Jimmy," he muttered to himself. "Just like training. You've done this a dozen times." Except in training, the aircraft hadn't been on fire and falling out of the sky. 5,000 feet. Jimmy took a deep breath, offered a quick prayer to whatever gods looked after fighter pilots, and pushed himself up and out of the cockpit. The wind caught him immediately, slamming him backward against the Hellcat's fuselage. For a terrifying moment he thought he was going to be pinned there, unable to clear the aircraft. But then he was tumbling free, sky and sea rotating crazily in his vision. Blue, gray, blue, gray, blue, gray. 4,000 feet, though he had no way to know that anymore. His hands scrabbled for the D-ring on his parachute, the metal ring that would deploy his chute and, hopefully, save his life. His fingers found it, closed around the cool metal, pulled with all his strength. Nothing happened. Panic surged through him like ice water. Had the cable been cut during the fight? Was the mechanism jammed? Was he going to die falling toward the Philippine Sea at terminal velocity? He pulled again, harder, and this time felt the cable give. There was a soft whoosh sound, then a crack like a rifle shot as the pilot chute deployed, followed by a bone-jarring jerk as the main canopy opened. The harness straps dug brutally into his shoulders and groin, squeezing the air from his lungs, but he was decelerating, slowing, drifting instead of falling. Jimmy looked up and saw the most beautiful sight of his life, a full canopy of white silk spread above him, intact and functional. He looked down and saw his Hellcat, still burning, continuing its spiral downward. He watched as it hit the water 3,000 feet below, the impact sending up a huge geyser of white water. The ocean swallowed it in seconds, and then there was nothing but a spreading oil slick and a few floating pieces of debris. The sky around him was empty now. The dogfight had moved on, the surviving aircraft either pursuing fleeing Japanese bombers or heading back to the fleet. He was alone, drifting down toward a vast empty ocean under a parachute, his burns and bruises beginning to make themselves known now that the adrenaline was starting to fade. 2,000 feet. Jimmy could see the water clearly now, see the swells rolling across its surface, see his shadow growing larger as he descended. He reached down and inflated his life vest, feeling it puff up around his chest and neck. He'd been briefed on this. Feet together, knees slightly bent, chin tucked, be ready for a hard landing in water. Release the parachute immediately or it could drag you under. 1,000 feet. He braced himself, took a deep breath, and prepared to hit the water. The impact with the ocean was harder than Jimmy had expected. The water felt like concrete, driving the air from his lungs and sending shock waves of pain through his legs and back. He went under, the parachute's weight pulling him down into green dimness. His hands found the quick-release catches on his parachute harness and slapped them open. The straps fell away and he kicked upward, breaking the surface with a gasp. The water was warm, almost bathwater temperature, and relatively calm despite the swells. His life vest kept him afloat without effort. But as the immediate panic of the bailout faded, other sensations rushed in to replace it. His hands were badly burned where they'd gripped the Hellcat's controls during those final flaming seconds. His face felt tight and raw. His left shoulder throbbed where something, shrapnel, debris, he didn't know, had hit him during the explosion. Jimmy treaded water and did a slow 360, scanning the horizon. To the east, he could see distant smudges of smoke marking the position of the fleet, probably 20 or 25 miles away. Far too distant to swim to. To the west, the sky was still marked with aerial combat, tiny specks wheeling and turning, occasional flashes as something exploded or caught fire. But none of it was close enough to signal. He was alone in the Philippine Sea, and the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. The water was full of sharks. His bleeding burns would attract them. The sun was already intense, and he had no shade, no fresh water. Even with his life vest, hypothermia could set in after long enough exposure. Despite the warm temperature, the body heat loss in water was much faster than in air. But he was alive. That was more than the pilots of the 4 aircraft he'd shot down could say. The hours that followed blurred together into a kind of waking nightmare. The sun climbed higher, beating down with merciless intensity. Jimmy's burns, which had been manageable at first, began to hurt worse as the salt water irritated them. His lips cracked and split. His throat felt like sandpaper. Several times he saw dark shapes moving beneath him. Sharks, probably, though they never came close enough to be certain. He tried to stay positive, to focus on survival techniques they'd taught him. Conserve energy, don't panic, trust that rescue would come. The fleet knew approximately where the dogfight had occurred. They'd send out search aircraft and submarines. The Dumbo rescue planes, the big PBY Catalinas, would be looking for downed pilots. He just had to stay alive long enough to be found. Around mid-afternoon, he heard engines. High engines, aircraft engines. He looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw a flight of Hellcats passing overhead at about 5,000 feet, heading back toward the fleet. Jimmy splashed frantically, waving his arms despite the pain it caused, but they were too high, too far away. They didn't see him. The sun continued its arc across the sky. Late afternoon became evening. The water took on shades of purple and gold as sunset approached. Jimmy's mind began to wander, drifting between consciousness and something that wasn't quite sleep but wasn't quite waking either. He found himself thinking about home, a small town in Kansas where his mother still kept his bedroom exactly as he'd left it. About Susan, the girl he'd dated in high school who'd promised to wait for him. About his father, who'd been a pilot in the First World War and had taught Jimmy to fly in an old Stearman biplane when he was 16. Would they ever know what happened to him? Would they know that he'd shot down 4 enemy aircraft in a burning fighter? Would it matter? Just as full darkness was falling, he heard a different sound, a deeper, heavier engine note. And beneath it, the unmistakable sound of a hull pushing through water. Jimmy forced his eyes open, looking around wildly. At first he saw nothing. Then, materializing out of the gathering dusk like a ghost, came the low, sleek silhouette of a submarine. The USS Tang, he would learn later. One of the lifeguard submarines stationed near the probable paths of returning American aircraft, specifically to pick up downed pilots. The sub surfaced fully, water streaming from its conning tower. Sailors appeared on deck, and one of them was pointing at Jimmy. A raft was launched, and 2 men paddled toward him with strong, steady strokes. Jimmy tried to call out, but his voice was barely a croak. "We got you, buddy," one of the sailors said as they pulled him into the raft. His voice sounded impossibly kind. "We got you. You're safe now." They hauled him aboard the submarine, and a medic immediately began treating his burns. Someone else gave him water, just sips at first, they warned him. Too much too fast would make him sick. The submarine's captain, a lean man with weathered features and sharp eyes, came down to the tiny wardroom where they'd laid Jimmy on a bunk. "You Lieutenant Caldwell?" the captain asked. Jimmy nodded weakly. "We've been looking for you specifically. Your squadron radioed that you'd shot down 4 enemy aircraft while your fighter was on fire. They said you were one of the last pilots they saw before you went down." The captain smiled slightly. "Admiral Mitchell himself ordered us to find you. Said any pilot crazy enough to keep fighting in a burning aircraft deserved a personal extraction." Jimmy tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a cough. "I wasn't being brave, sir. I was being stubborn. There's a difference." "Maybe," the captain said. "But the fleet doesn't care. You and the other pilots broke up that Japanese strike before it could reach the carriers. They launched over 300 aircraft this morning. Less than 100 made it back to their carriers. It's the biggest aerial victory in naval history. They're already calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, just like you boys predicted. Over the following days, as Jimmy recovered aboard the Tang and eventually transferred back to the Lexington, he learned the full scope of what had happened on June 19, 1944. The Japanese had indeed committed their entire carrier air arm to a decisive battle, and they had been slaughtered. American pilots, with aircraft that could take punishment and keep fighting, had shot down over 300 enemy planes while losing only 29 of their own. The battle had effectively ended Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. Their carriers still floated, but they had no experienced pilots left to fly from them. The war in the Pacific had turned irreversibly in America's favor. Jimmy's actions, shooting down 4 enemy aircraft including 2 while his Hellcat was fully engulfed,